Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to join us at the Laureate Lecture of the 2022 Tang Prize in Sinology. I'm Angela Liu, your MC for today's event. To begin with, we would like to invite to the stage the host of this lecture, Professor David Derwei Wang, academician of Academia Sinica, to give us the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor Wang.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Wang. I teach modern Chinese and comparative literature at Harvard University. This is a great honor and a pleasure for me to host the lecture to be given by Professor Dame Jessica Rawson, winner of the 2022 Tang Prize in Sinology. Please allow me to say a few words about the achievements of Professor Rawson. Professor Rawson is one of the most distinguished scholars in the studies of ancient China. A China that is unique, but a China that probably is not the one we used to know or we want to know. And this is a unique civilization only in the sense of a global transculturation. And Professor Rawson's scholarship has taken us to an immense territory, an immense temporality through which China interacted with civilizations of other areas, regions, and even continents. In this sense, she has made an enormous contribution to our understanding of China in the past and China in the present. Professor Rawson is currently a professor in art history and archaeology at the University of Oxford. And she also is a winner of numerous recognitions in the world, worldwide. And she is a member of the British Academy and also an honorary member of American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And in 1992, she renovated the Asian Gallery in British Museum. And also she serves as the first female warden at the Merton College of Oxford in 1994. There are many other credits, which I will not summarize at this point. And I would like to say a few more words about her contribution in her field of specialties. You could tell from this slide that Professor Rawson is an author of numerous books which point to different directions of archaeological and art historical studies of ancient China. As I mentioned just now, her contribution lies in her hands-on and very material-oriented research of the objects in ancient Chinese civilizations through different periods. Through her research, she has guided us to a world in which various ethnicities, cultures, and regions interacted with the environment, the ecological mutations in ancient times. So the factor of nature and the factor of humanity sort of merged and mixed with each other in her study to give us a truly dynamic understanding of how China has come out to what it is now over the past 3,000 years or even 4,000 years. And particularly, I'm very proud to be a reader of Professor Rawson's most recent book, Life and Afterlife in Ancient China. I'm even having a copy of the book here with myself, and I definitely would like to have Professor Rawson's autograph after today's lecture. And in this particular book, Professor Rawson introduces to us 12 tombs from 12 regions all over China. And through these excavations of the tombs, she has told us one story after another about not only how objects have been represented and produced in such a way to formalize a truly intriguing civilization in ancient times, but also how the civilization has been developing under the effect of ecological transformations. So this kind of sort of interdisciplinary study of Rawson's scholarship has truly illuminated the way we better understand China and the world. So today, we are going to listen to Professor Rawson's lecture on one of the highlights of her most recent scholarship. And the title of the lecture is Bronze Banqueting Vessels and the Golden Belts in the Landscape of Ancient China of Today. And this is a fascinating lecture, and I've had the pleasure to read the script and gone over these slides. And it really deals with how different cultures and how different natural environments interacted with each other and generating this facts of transculturation. And today, we are focusing only two of such kind of a transculturation. On the one hand, how gold was introduced to China to become one of the most treasured symbols of Chinese culture. And yet, on the other hand, how this gold actually is to be understood as something from the outside, from the exteriority of our understanding of Chinese civilization. On the other hand, the bronze banqueting vessels that represent the other side of Professor Rawson's research of Chinese antiquity. And here, vessels are being taken up in relation to rituals, and particularly rituals related to the afterlife, the underlining, the underworld of the Chinese humanity. So on that point, she is going to develop a very, very unique, say, discovery of how China can be understood as a unique civilization as opposed to other civilizations worldwide. Now, without further ado, may I have the honor to invite Professor Rawson to give her lecture. Thank you.
I would like to thank, of course, Professor Wang for that wonderful introduction. He's obviously read everything I've written, and I'm quite overwhelmed by that thought. It is also a great honor to have been awarded the Tang Prize and to have my view of China brought more widely for you to listen to and to learn about. But the Tang Prize also is vitally important in spreading all sorts of important aspects of humanity's activities, and the role of China and the presence of China in our world is actually one of the most important features of today. I put the gold belt along with the bronze vessels to show you that I'm actually going to talk at three levels. I'm going to move from the objects to a much deeper view of how China has formed its culture and how it relates comparatively to the world of the West, because not only is so much of the power structure described by Professor Sachs dominated by ideas developed in the West, in fact, a lot of art history, anthropology, and the understanding of China is based on Western ideas. And I want to suggest that we should look more closely at China and see how its views and ideas are constructed. And it's typical in working in a museum or in a university to look closely at the objects, to think about what these represented and how they were made, to make qualitative views about whether they're beautifully made or less effectively made, whether elevating on the base is intended for some particular reason. In other words, we look closely at the objects and we think of their function in the society. And then if we turn to the belt, we see something completely different, a belt of either leather or hemp through a set of gold rings. These are actual circular oval rings around the belt. And actually, it's quite impossible to see anything like this in China. So I'm going to contrast the two societies that made these two different categories of object, but I'm going to go much further and argue that we also should think about the underlying geography, the underlying environment in which these two societies were created. And I'm going to suggest that we don't do that often enough, and it's these underlying fractures across the Eurasian continent that determine not only the past, but today. So I shall show many maps, and this map has some benefits. I'm not very good on the different buttons. This is China, and I'm going to call it China, though in the period in which I study, it is not China. It's a large area, a large landmass. But you can see from the vegetation that there's an enormous difference here. This is an area of very high land and also enormous deserts. And I'm going to talk a lot about the Tibetan Plateau. And then out here in the north, this is not crops. This is the taiga, the great forests of Russia leading into the tundra. So if we go to the next slide, it's not, is this close enough? Here you see the geography better. And one thing I would like to emphasize today, as in the past, this is East Asia's largest cropping land. This makes China exceptionally prosperous alongside everybody else. And they add to it this little, it's quite a large basin, the size of England, really, that adds more cropping land. So China is already the dominant power through its crops. But then we're going to look at the Loess, and I've marked a few sites I'm going to mention. But above all, I want you to notice this. This is something that lies between Western Asia and China. And all too often, the whole of Chinese history is compared with that of Western Asia. But there is absolutely no way to walk across this. If you have animals and population that is not acclimatized to these enormous heights, you cannot walk. So the only walking area is up here. But this huge desert, this very high land drives people this way, across these mountains, and then this way. Now, we talk a lot about the Silk Road. We will come to the Silk Road, but actually what is much more important is that the contact is across the steppe and through these very high mountains. And you will see why they're important as we go along. But over here, it's quite a long way to this cropping land. So we're talking about a large part of Eurasia, and it is all interlinked in the past and now. These are a few photographs showing the Great Plain, China's enormous plain. This is millet and vegetables, this is rice. And here, however, we have a desert. And there are many, many deserts included in the territory we today call China. And we also, this is quite a mild-looking mountain, but it's quite far north. They're growing maize, actually, which is imported from America much later. And there are huge mountains in China. If we go back briefly, people often talk about the steppes, that China has this very high land. It steps down to this region and then down here. The great danger for this region is flooding. And even every year now, we still have enormous flooding. But if we go back to Tibet, I want to emphasize that it is not possible to cross. And in ancient times and today, you aren't going to take a big hike through it. This is the edge of Tibet on the eastern end. This is the view from Sichuan province. And this is the kind of landscape you encounter, but there are many different landscapes across this high plateau. It's about 4,000 to 5,000 meters high, when we would find 2,500 meters quite enough. So that 5,000 is much too much for daily life as we know it. Now, this has enormous impact on the relationship today between China and the West. And this is what lies behind my argument, that we must, in fact, pay attention to our everyday lives. And the everyday lives with which we are educated, brought up and educated, have an enormous impact on us, and that remains the case. And here you see the next fundamental ecological problem, that the two climates are quite different. On the west, you have the western winds from the Atlantic. On the east, you're in the Pacific monsoon, and both have serious borders. You cannot cross the border and still find the crops. If you cross those lines, you're in a much wider steppe area or mountainous deserts, and there the livelihood is based on animals. And it's this basis on animals is absolutely fundamental. In the West, we're quite used to a double livelihood, if you like, of animals and crops. If you go to the Alps, you'll have more animals. If you go to lowland England, you might find crops. If you go, however, into the center of Eurasian continent, the livelihood is dependent on very, very large herds of animals and enormous mobility. Now, we talk about nomadism, but that's not the right word. These people are pastoralists who have defined regions in which they may herd their animals. And herding animals requires great skill. Breeding large numbers requires even more skill. And they are not taken in any large scale into this area here. This is too wet. It's too damp and too flooded and too marshy in early periods. So this area has a huge population because they're not competing for the ground with animals. And this is a completely different ecology from the one with which we're familiar in the West, and the mobility that animals confer on Western populations is missing in East Asia. So we should be quite clear that the mobility, which we call nomadism, it actually affects Europeans and Western Asian populations enormously and has done for centuries. And it has not affected China in the same way. So I just put this in a more cartoon form. Here you see Tibet. And here you see that it is the blockage between agricultural China and Western Asia and the Mediterranean. The link, there's a double link. There's the Oasis Desert link, which we call the Silk Road, and there is the Steppe Road. And you can travel, you can travel here with difficulty. It takes 2,000 years for the herded animals to be moved across the Eurasian steppe through the Altai Mountains to the lowest plateau and down here. In fact, the main herded animals do not make it into agricultural China. And however, they dominate not only Western Europe, but also large parts of Western Asia, where the people are equally mobile. So we have, if you like, three areas. We have the sedentary, very, very rich agricultural China. We have Western Asia with a degree of mobility, and Mediterranean also. And we have the large routes across which people do move, and they move at different times. But I wouldn't present it as a trade route. I will, in fact, argue that it's a horse route. Now, I'm going to summarize a few of the stark contrasts between the West and the East. Here you see quite different uses of metal. On the left, you get this beautiful cast figure of a deity made in the Mediterranean area. And here, those vessels I showed you before, these are used for the offerings of food and drink to the ancestors. And they're buried in tombs, but they're also used in everyday life. So they're completely different technical abilities. The availability of metal is different, and the technical casting system is completely different, and the purpose for which they're used is markedly different. And if we go from the figure of Poseidon to the god Ammon and his clutching the figure of the ruler Tutankhamun between his knees, you see this constant effort to present deities and power in human form. And this is immensely different from China. China does not go for sculptures that present power in human form. What they do is to make vessels to ensure that the ancestors are continually present and provided for. And if there was one difference between the Western group west of Tibet and the Eastern group east of Tibet, I would go to this. They lead to two completely different societies, and we need, in the modern world, as Professor Sachs has said, to show respect for both systems. What results from these two belief systems is in the West, we have religious domination by individual groups, the Christians, the Jews, and Islam in the later medieval period, and they generate communities of believers who do not have to be related to each other. They are not kin-based. They are of different statuses and levels, often of different tribes. They're much more diverse, and they form a semi-egalitarian group. In China, the ancestor cult is confined to the family and the clan, and this leads to a pyramid structure in which seniority dominates. And then this seniority also dominates in localities, in village organization, in local organization, and eventually in the state. And we have to recognize these two different belief systems that inform the whole of the social structure if we are to appreciate the enormous strength of China. Because China proves itself again and again to be one of the most strong and dominant social and belief systems in the world. Because despite many incursions, many people invading China, and also the movement of beliefs on the Yellow River moving south a long way, thousands of kilometers, despite all that diversity and movement, the belief system remains dominant. There are, of course, some very simple comparisons one can make of gold in the West and jade in the East, and there's plenty to say about that. I won't go into it in detail. You're looking at decorations around the necks from Britain and Ireland and from the Scythians, the Greek-influenced Scythians near the Black Sea. And here we have one very early jade, but the other two are quite late, around the Han period, that is 200 BC. So we're doing very well in this comparison, but this is a quite light-hearted one if we just look at the items. However, if we look at what lies below the ground, we see something quite different. And this is a very, very important difference. China consists here, as you see, of different geological plates. And if you ignore the plates, you fail to see that the gold is actually more concentrated in this northern plate, which is part of the Altai Mountains of Siberia and of Mongolia, and this is not a gold area. So, but it's even more serious for the Chinese in the early periods that copper is not well distributed in this northern plate. So that looking for copper has to take place on the Yangtze River or occasional small amounts in the northern provinces. So this is part of the incredible industrial level skill with which China looked for resources and then used these enormous amounts of bronze, that is, involving copper, tin, How they got to the tin, none of us understand. The tin is most abundant today here in the far south, and of course lead, which is ubiquitous and is used also with the copper and tin to a limited degree. So wherever there are mountains, there are more likely to be resources of metallic kind. But if we just remember that I said that China had the biggest agricultural area here in the east, the whole of East Asia, that is not a place to find metal. And I also want to stress that China is perhaps the most successful country in creating a language that can be understood universally. Though there are many different languages and dialects in China, it has a script that everybody from north to south can read, and also a script of the distant past here on the oracle bone that is intelligible today. That is quite remarkable. There's no other country in the world where the past and the different regions can be united in this way by a single script. So that this gives China a, if you like, social political solidarity that is absent everywhere else. And here, if we go to the west, here I've chosen something from the great Persian Empire, the Achaemenids, who in the 5th century BC wrote their script out. They used the same script, the cuneiform, but they wrote in Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite, and those are all pronounced in different ways, have different grammars, different associations, different social structures, and so we too, by using English and using the Phoenician-derived script, lead to enforcing a nation consciousness through the different languages in our different states. So China has several strengths: the great cropping area, the development of the shared belief in the power of the ancestors, and this script. And in my book, which Professor Wong has mentioned, I've shown how this makes for an enormous, if you like, southward movement of a single culture that creates the China we know today. So if we go to the next slide, however, we see that there's a further geological issue. Here, we're looking at the Forbidden City on the one hand, and again, we're looking at Iran. Iran is an extremely important country to Western Europe, and to the Greeks, it's greatly underestimated, but it shows that we in the West favor stone, and here in the East, they favor a platform structure on which wood is used. And the wood is developed in a particularly clever way so that it can be prepared in a workshop, carried to the site, and put up immediately. This is part of the extraordinary technical achievement. Long before we have computers, China has a production system that nobody else can match, and they exploit it in their architecture. But the reason for their structure is this. Here, I've marked on a map a very clear Loess Plateau. This is an area of extreme dusty sand that in the west is several hundred meters deep. In the east, it's more here or here. It's more like 10 meters. And in between, among these mountains, it may be as much as 30. The sand covers the ground, like you see here, and you don't find stone. And so as the culture developed in the late Neolithic, we're talking 2000 BC, they were already making platforms and already placing wooden structures on platforms. So that this embodied, it set up an architectural style that lasts to now, down to the 19th century, and you will have all seen it in the Forbidden City or the temples of the Buddhism and for the elites. So this is something that architectural historians, archaeologists almost never mention, but I think if they don't mention it, they're missing one of the most important features of China that leads to a complete difference of approach to the environment, to building, to use of resources in the West and the East. I could elaborate on why Taipei looks like it does, but it is partly because they have taken their architectural system from America and they've missed out the whole stone structure which led to the 18th and 19th century versions of Roman buildings, Gothic buildings, and so on. And here a bit more on the Loess. I'm particularly fascinated by it. This is the Yellow River in the semi-north. It's not very far north. It goes completely yellow, as you can see. This is what the cropping land looks like. It's now much more covered in green, but this is, if you make terraces in this Loess, this is what it looks like. And it's so stable that you can dig and live in cave houses. And from the late Neolithic, there are cave houses across this huge area. And when I talk next at the National Palace Museum, I will talk more about these exceptional tombs. China has the most important tomb culture in the world, and it's never talked about because it's not visible above ground. But this tomb goes down between 14 and 15 meters. That's the height of a 3- or 4-story house. And the Loess is completely stable when it's dug down in this way, and it remains open while the funeral is conducted. This is a tomb at Anyang, that is of the 1200s BC in the royal cemetery. This is a royal Shang tomb, and I've just put a little table on one side showing that it's probable that these deep digging started with wells to get to water in an area that is extremely arid. So this is an unknown area. This is an area that I've been particularly interested in and have written a paper which is being reviewed at the moment about how these tombs developed. And these are the startup of the tombs we all know much better, the great Tang tombs, the great Ming tombs, and the great Qing tombs. It is not a system that stopped. It went on, and it provides the mansions, the palaces, and of the elite for the afterlife. And we should never, never underestimate the importance of the afterlife and the role of the ancestors in the lives of everybody in what I would call the Chinese-speaking region, both in the past and today. It's always grievously omitted. People talk about Confucianism or Buddhism. No, you should go right back to the Bronze Age and beyond, before that to the Neolithic, where the provision for the afterlife is extremely complex and extremely beautifully done. Indeed, this is a set of banqueting vessels, and that's why I mentioned the banqueting vessels. The banqueting vessels, in some way, provide the definition of this ancestral cult in the early dynasties of the Shang and the Zhou, and they are extremely valuable in terms of metal. Nothing like this is made in the West. We could not afford, in the Bronze Age, to use such quantities of metal in making such vessels. And here, too, the Loess is exploited. These are a couple of mold fragments recovered from a site of the Shang dynasty, and the research on them is extremely complicated. There are lots of debates about it. And more, they have learned that it's the Loess that makes for this very, very fine decoration. Without the Loess, the casters, the metallurgists of the past would not have hit on something so elaborate and so finely decorated. This skill, this usage is confined to the central dynastic sites. Here you can see that I've put the vessels here in the red dots. These are sites one could argue are occupied or controlled by the dynasties of the Shang down to the 11th century and then onwards through the Zhou. In fact, carries right on to just before the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century. So the vessels and the ancestral cult is really closely associated with this large, very prosperous cropping area. Round the edge, something else is happening. The bronze casting skills are used or known about, but they're used quite differently by very different people. I'm not going to talk today about the south, but the south is an area of immense importance because it is, in a sense, the bank or the reservoir to which people could move when difficulties moved in from the north. There is absolutely continuous movement from the north, and therefore, over time, people move south to this very fertile, but also very, very wet area, the big Yangtze River, and its tributaries, and it's in this area that quite different bronzes are found. So China is a country of great regions, and what we have to understand is how this group of people's beliefs and systems of living and government gradually indeed move south. It has much less ability to move north outside the cropping area because this is not an area where large sedentary villages can be built. So, to sum up before I turn to the northern area, we've looked at quite a lot of, we've seen this area so far. This is where central China has been developing, and it is going to move south, and over time, this is the area where Europeans encountered China. So I'm not going to go into that period, but this is where the encounter with the Europeans took place and where the arguments about trade took place. I'm now going to go to the fact that this is the area across which people moved. And it's the movement of these people and the society that they created here that we need to think about as part of the geopolitical structure of ancient China and of today. We cannot ignore the fact that this area is immensely important. China has these three boundaries. It has the Tibetan boundary, which they've incorporated because the rivers are so valuable. They have this northern boundary between today, what is China and Mongolia and the Soviet Union, or no, the Federal Russian Federation. And here they have a sea boundary, which leads them to the Pacific. And those remain, those were always the boundaries, and they remain the boundaries. And this is the same picture showing you the Tibetan plateau, and here we see the problem. Here we find a group of people who have large herds, almost no trees, no cabbages, no crops. They can grow a few crops underneath the tents. If they live in tents, they live in yurts, and then in the summer or the spring, they raise the tents. The ground beneath the tent is soft, and they can plant crops, they plant millet, they move with their herds, and then they come back and harvest it 45 days later. So it is possible to grow crops, it is possible to have winter villages, but they're basically mobile, but they have negotiated group by group to see which areas each group may use for pasture. And the horses are critical. The animals, the sheep and goats and the cattle were domesticated in northern Mesopotamia on what is called the hilly flanks. The horses were probably domesticated in the western steppe or near Anatolia. All of them move over 2,000 years towards China as they displace the hunters that lived there before. And this is very easy to look at the pictures of horses in China or to look at the tomb figures and think these are friendly. They are not. They are the tanks, the powerful weapons of their time. And riding them is an absolutely essential skill that is developed in the north, outside China. And I've spent time visiting these areas. This is Mongolia, and here you see what is called a deer stone. This is a deer stone with a portrait of an individual at the top. This is his ornaments. This is a rubbing of everything on that stone. And these are deer on his clothes, and he has a belt. So first time we meet a belt. You don't need belts in China. You have a sash round hanging clothes. But here you have a belt with weapons. And the horses are an essential part. Here is a burial mound, and around them are deposits of horse heads and horse hooves. This is all in Mongolia, and these are the product of rituals where the people return yearly or monthly to offer a ritual to the dead. So we're in a very different world. instead of the food and drink that are offered to the ancestors in China, we're looking at a group of people with horses who offer their precious horses as offerings to the dead. So we're in a different world. And this world never mixes on the northern slopes, but the Chinese are extremely skillful in bringing in people into China who have horses, enabling them to defend themselves against these fierce opponents, and they convert them into members of Chinese society. And this is probably one of the aspects of China that is completely overlooked. The horses are, of course, completely connected all the way back across Eurasia. They've come across Eurasia here, and they've come and they've gone also north into Europe. And if we want to understand today's problems that Professor Sachs outlined, we have to remember it's not that we are naturally fighters. We have always had tanks, and we've always had them in the form of horses. And China has not exploited their horses in the same way because they have used them to fight the north, and the elite have never ridden horses. The elite, the kings of France and Britain, of Germany, of Hungary, have always ridden. In the East, the elite are educated, they're great writers, they write documents, they keep records, and there's a very different social structure which we ignore. But we shouldn't ignore, of course. Here is an example of the kind of celebration of the horse in the steppe. And there are two examples in Kazakhstan where they've given the horses the great curving horn of a mountain goat, an argali. And so they dress their horses like this, both as ornament and in death. And here is one from the extreme north we're going to talk about. And this is, again, a horse buried with all these ornaments in Kazakhstan. And this gets adopted in the borders of China. So here come the horses into China. They come as part of the chariot, and also here the manager of the horses of the chariot wears a belt, has deer on his rear, has a strange hairstyle. He might even be riding. This is a manager of a horse, but employed in China. So China has to bring in people, bring in the horses, and bring in the managers, and they bury both. But there's a problem for the horses here. The problem is this nutrition called selenium. This is the Se means selenium, it's a mineral, and it's very short supply across this area. This is a climatic and environmental problem, and this means that horses can be kept in Gansu province in the north of the Ordos region or here in Liaoning, but they cannot be well bred where the light blue is. And it's no good hoping to breed horses here. It's far too hot, far too humid, and far too marshy. So there is a problem with horses that remains down to today. And today, selenium is added to salt and other aspects of food in China to make sure that humans don't suffer from this, because otherwise they have what is called the Kashin-Beck disease. So this is showing you again the map question and the environment. And now if we turn to the gold, we see that it's in this northern area, which is the part of Mongolia. This is Mongolia is here, the Russian Federation is here. The gold is in this area in particular. This is the Altai, and Altai is the word for gold in Mongolian. So I'm just going to show you one major site in Russia. This is north of Mongolia. It's called Arjan, and almost nobody, when I talk to a classicist in Britain, knows about Arjan, but it is the most important site where gold is used and people rode horses for the first time, probably from the 9th century BC. And this is an absolutely central site, as important as Tutankhamun, as important as Anyang in China, and it has, as you can see, a whole row of burials. These are the tombs of the local lords, and their clothes are covered in gold, and they carry a gold quiver and neck ornaments. This is a man and his spouse. And The Tuva Republic is hard to get at, and the objects from this tomb are mainly in the Tuva Republic, but it is absolutely renowned across the whole of Russia and those of us who work on the relationship between the North and China. This is the man himself in a reconstruction wearing his belt, and people who wear belts are northerners. They ride and they have their weapons hanging from their belts. So if you see a belt in China, you're looking at a northerner. Here is his belt, here's his dagger, these are the horses that are on his cap, and these are the panthers that are on his clothes. So it's a whole glitter. This man is immensely wealthy, he's immensely powerful, he's got a great series of clans who offer him support, and through the herding system and the enormous number of animals in his herds will be very important. And this comes to the borders of China. So I've shown you up here Ajan, and here Ajan is in relation to the main part of China, and now we're going to look at Yuhuangmiao, which is here, and this is the mountains on the edge of Beijing, north of Beijing. This is the Yan Mountains, and people who write saying it's easy to walk into China are wrong. It is not easy to walk into China, and there are these huge mountains, and this is where, to defend Beijing, they built part of the Great Wall. And now we see a burial from this region, and we see for the first time in the Chinese territory the burial of horses' heads. This is not a member of the Chinese elite at all. He couldn't be. He has gold panther around his neck. He has a belt hook in an animal style. He has boars on his clothes. These are all little bronzes here, all little bronze animals like the man had in gold. And he has steppe weapons. Here, a dagger and a knife. And this is the man I showed you before. He has this dagger and knife, and the man at Yuhuangmiao on the edge of Beijing has a dagger and a knife, and they share the same form of belt. So this is the actual belt, reconstructed. This is an example from this belt, and this is an example from the belt near Beijing. So these people near Beijing have moved across the steppe towards China. And this is an absolutely essential part of the dialogue that is going on between China and its neighbors for centuries. And it brings important technologies into China, the herding of animals, the creation of iron in particular, because the dagger is of iron, the use of horses, of course, and in due course, many other kinds of technology, including inlaid weapons and dairy products, the lot. And I'm now showing you a second example of this trend of the people in the north moving quite a long way into what we today call China. This is Gansu province. Here is a different place. We're here right in the west. This is the edge of the Great Wall. In the west, we've been up here. Now we're here. This whole area is enduring, suffering, as the Chinese would say, from intrusions. But it's the power of these people in the Altai Mountains, their gold and their huge hordes, that is making this movement possible. So it is not a silk route, it's a horse empire that is moving towards a hugely rich, settled empire, and they interact continuously. So this is the man in that area, is one of the people buried in the cemetery near at Majiayuan. And here he has, you can see, he has 3 belts. This is the sort of belt this kind of man had in this area. We're talking quite late, the 4th, 3rd century BC. He's in a catacomb. There's a particular kind of steppe burial, and he has a large number of chariots, brilliantly decorated, which are also showing the skill of these people to adapt to the Chinese area, where chariots are very important still. They are riders, but they're also chariots. So we're seeing the creation of a second, if you like, polity or series of polities across from east to west. This is not a west to east, this is an east to west movement, and you see the gold belts. These are plaques from a gold belt put together by someone who is one of my students who's worked particularly on the technology of the belt, of how these different gold decorations are made, but they're part of the belts, really. And they go from Arjan, they come this way, and from Arjan here, they go west. And so most people in the West will think of the Scythians, of Ukraine, of Crimea. But we should remember that these are the strongest and most important groups of the, if you like, the possible opponents of China, but also one of the sources of technology, of interaction of people and of animals. And this shows you their weapons. And again, you see the same thing, similar technologies, similar decoration. This is from Marjayuan. This is actually later, but in a totally steppe style. Here's Arjan, and we're moving west towards the Black Sea. So this whole area is linked together by people who share a particular way of life. And I think that's a very important feature, that we in the West are only too familiar with these people. They are the Huns who invaded Rome. They're the German groups who invaded the whole of Northern Europe. And here, China did a better job in some ways by fending them off somewhat and incorporating them within their state so that they benefited directly from their state without being taken over. The Chinese language, the Chinese ancestral sacrifices, the offerings continued. They were not interrupted by these people. They acted as contributors. They were often converted into the Chinese practices, but unlike in the West, they did not take over the states. So we see two very different reactions to these very, very powerful groups of people. And I think one should never underestimate the mobility and the animals. We are only too willing to say that being settled based on crop farming is the most powerful group of people. I think I would always pay a lot of attention to the mobile and the people with large numbers of animals, because with animals, when faced by famine, faced by ice, as these people often are, you can move. And that gave them great flexibility and made it possible to populate the whole of this area. This is an enormous area, much larger than China, much larger than Europe, and very, very hostile in very bad winters. And we see the way they infiltrate. We've met this man several times. He's from Arjan. Here is the Oxus treasure. It shows them entering Iran. Here we see a similar man, belts, boots, wonderful gold decoration. He's in Kazakhstan. And here we see a member of the Terracotta Warriors. What does that tell us? He's wearing a belt. He's got short tunics. He's wearing soft trousers. And above all, he has soft shoes. And the soft shoes tell us, like this man, and this man, and this man, that he's a rider. So the riders in the Terracotta Warriors, in the army of the Qin Emperor, were outsiders. They had been brought into China. They brought the horses as well, and they've made the Qin powerful. So this is an example of the adaptation and skill of the Qin and their background, the Chinese language, the calligraphy of the characters and of the ancestral offerings and the belief in the power of the family and of the ancestors that has led the dominance of that set of Chinese protocols, if you like, or Chinese beliefs, Chinese practices, and has enabled China to do different forms of adaptation of the presence and proximity of the outsiders, actually right down to the time of the Qing dynasty, who are, of course, just another member of the outsiders. The Qin also, despite being a rather Western group of people, had already adopted the offerings to the ancestors in food and drink, as here, but actually on this piece, you see two animals. They combine features of the traditional Chinese offerings with features of the pastoral life that they knew. And this use of these ancient vessels carries right down into the Ming and Qing here in copies, which you see in ceramic, but I could produce today for you images of these bronzes in offices of the party, in temples, and in great palaces around China, so that the tradition of this offering to the ancestors has continued and is recognized throughout China as an essential part of their history, and we ignore it all the time. So as a Westerner, as a European, what I think is the most important thing we should do and can do is to think more deeply about what the paraphernalia is, what the objects are, what the way of life, what the belief system is of China, what unites it, even down to today, and consider the power that it has given them over many millennia. So here I summarize what I've said. There is this complete division at Tibet with the ancestral beliefs, the Chinese characters, the Chinese construction system against the stone, the multiple languages of the West, and the figural sculpture of the West. And they're joined together by the people of the gold belts and by, above all, the horses. And we shouldn't romanticize the horses. The horses are the weapons of the past. They are essential to the skill of this central group, and it's a skill that until the 19th century was dominant in Europe and in the USA. It is not anymore. Now we are into a different technology, but it's just as dominant here. Here are the gas pipelines of the Eurasian continent, and they're moving from the Russian Federation into China. And here is one of the largest copper mines in the world, and it's in Mongolia. And that is essential for the electric cars and the electric system of energy for the Chinese. And this is part of their monopoly of this section. We have to remember that it's part of a long seam of copper that runs across Central Asia and to the north, but it's inaccessible in the north of China and in the Central Plains. They have to use this northern group. So the gold has been replaced by the copper, and the horses have been replaced by the gas, but we're still in the same dialogue that we always were. And those of us who underestimated the relationship between the Russian Federation and China should think hard about this ancient gift to the world and of China's power then and now. So I end with a map again. We should always look at the map. We should remember the three boundaries. And we should remember that in order to understand how this region hangs together, we need to look at the past as well as the present. And we need to be less categorical about what will work and what will not work. We need to think about how people construct their society and how they present it to themselves, because we all present our social and our artistic life to ourselves, and we present it in churches in the West, in great tombs in the East. We think differently, and we have different priorities, and we must never think that our priorities need to override everybody else's. We need, in other words, to be balanced and think about the different roles that different people play across this huge, huge area. We belong to the far end in the West, but you here dominate in the East. I'm delighted to be here to tell you about the world that I've come to know and love. It's a difficult world, but it has been a very exciting journey for me. And I hope that everybody who is younger and working in this area will go forward and think further about the relationship of these different ecologies and landfalls to each other. Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, they're all part of one story. They're not separate. They're joined together, and you have to work with all of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Professor Rawson. Please take your seat. Thank you. And now we would like to invite back to the stage Professor Wang to give us the conclusion.
Professor Rawson started her lecture by highlighting the factors of environment, such as climate, such as ecological and geographical and geological dynamics that predetermine the matrix of a civilization such as China. She then moved on to talk about the human factor which enact or enable the possibility of contact and communication between people of different continents, regions, areas, and cultures and civilizations. So this is truly a very lively history that we have been through over the past 3,000 or 4,000 years. Through minute details, particularly details in relation to objects such as a dagger, the patterns of a dagger, such as a gold belt, such as banquet vessels, bronze artifacts, and so on and so forth. Professor Rawson was able to discern the very nuanced communications and networkings among different peoples and regions and even civilizations. And therefore, as a result, she was able to tell us a truly marvelous history about not only China, but also the whole world. And this history cannot be only understood through language as we normally get access to, but also through objects. So here, the material entities from ancient times to the present serve as the linkages that help us to better understand the immensity and the perplexity of Chinese civilization in particular and human civilization in general. This is a truly remarkable scholarship, and only we have this 1 hour to learn so much from Professor Jessica Rawson. I believe many of you, like me, just couldn't wait to read more of her scholarship through her books and the discoveries. But on this note, we'll have to conclude our lecture today. Thank you very much, Professor Rawson, for your contribution to Chinese and the sinological studies. And thank you, everybody, for your being here to share this very treasurable period of time with all of us in honor of the Tang Prize laureate. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Wang, and thank you once again to our laureate, Professor Rawson. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the laureate lecture for Sinology. Thank you for joining us this morning. Please don't forget your personal belongings as you leave, and we wish you a good day. 各位来宾，第5届唐奖得奖人演讲汉学场到这边告一个段落，非常感谢您的参与，也希望大家都有满满的收获。离场时，请记得您随身携带的物品，并且归还您所借取的同步口译接收器，取回您的证件。祝福各位平安顺心，谢谢。